Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me. For those who do not know me yet, my name is Ron Levine from Mindfulness in Blue Jeans, and I have been practicing mindfulness and insight meditation for almost 25 years. I started during a time when I was dealing with clinical anxiety and depression and a raging panic disorder that had blown up into agoraphobia. So I was on disability from work. I couldn't leave the house. I couldn't go past my front door without melting down into a puddle of panic. And was fortunate enough to be paired up with a psychologist who, even back in the late 90s, was several decades deep into practicing and teaching mindfulness and insight meditation. And this is what he offered me as a way of dealing with what I was going through. And I was not thrilled with his suggestion. My feeling was, I can't go out, I can't work, I can't do anything. My life is effectively stopped, and here's this guy talking about watching the breathing and stuff. I'm like, huh? So I was basically at home all day anyway, because I was busy panicking and not doing anything else. And I figured, all right, I'm going to give this a shot just long enough I can go back to him and say, look, dude, this didn't work. Can I have the real treatment now, please? And as I say, this was almost 25 years ago, and I have never had that conversation with him. And I still practice every day, and I teach. It's made a huge difference in my life, and no one was more surprised than I was. And so here I am, and here you are, and thank you for being with me. Today's topic is cultivating sanity. And what's funny is I haven't done this one in a couple of years. And I actually reused, word for word, the same description for this event that I used 2 years ago, which makes reference to this increase in perceived craziness in the world. And this is what we were experiencing 2 years ago, and it seems to apply just as much today, right? And it probably applied just as much 4 years ago and 6 years ago. The notes that I had for this session from 2 years ago made mention of something about The Daily Show and a question of karma versus consequence. So I can only imagine, because I don't remember at this point, I must have been watching an episode of The Daily Show where somebody said, what's the difference between karma and consequence? And the answer, by and large, is not a hell of a lot. You know, when I talk about karma, of course, I'm talking about karma in the Buddhist sense. So I'm not talking about the revenge and justice-based kind of karma we think of in Western society where, you know, he's going to get his and what goes around comes around and so forth. We're really talking about cause and effect. And I spend a fair amount of time in other sessions talking about the 3 pillars of karma: intention, attention, perception. I'm not going to get into that too much here, but I do want to talk about this notion of cause and effect, of causality. This perceived craziness, this chaos. I deliberately say it is perceived. And this goes for both our inner and our outer worlds. And I'm going to talk about the outer world first. When we think about the things going on this mud ball that we are all trying to occupy together, there's this sense of craziness. I find it very helpful to draw a distinction between craziness as being about the amount and perhaps the intensity and perhaps the characteristics of the activity that is going on in the world, as opposed to thinking of it in terms of chaos and actual disorder. What I mean by actual disorder is things happening without causes. There's all kinds of crazy shit going on right now. That's actually kind of the norm. I remember reading something a couple of years ago saying all the craziness that we seem to be seeing right now is actually the way it's been for most of human history. It seems like up until a few years ago, there was a decade or two of relative calm. And that was actually the anomaly. That was actually the anomaly. We're kind of back to our norm now, for better or for worse. But there's a really important distinction when we're talking about this perceived craziness, because it's not actual craziness in the sense of events happening without cause. I remember one of my old yoga teachers used to have this really great example about how if you looked at blood cells under a microscope, it looked like absolute chaos, utter disorder, mayhem. But when we zoom out and look at the whole that it's just a tiny part of, then you begin to see how it's actually, it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. There's actually reason and order behind this. In fact, things would go sideways very quickly if it wasn't doing what it is doing, that when we zoom in far enough, looks friggin' crazy. It's just a matter of our vantage point, our ability to now see the causes and effects as they are interweaving. So one of the things that we talk about in Buddhism a lot is interdependent causality. And really the crux of the Buddhist teachings, which are ultimately about how do we stop our own suffering, is about seeing the relationships between causes and events over space and time. When this happens, that happens, say, almost simultaneously. Or when this happens, and maybe that happens, and that happens, and that happens, they all kind of coalesce over time, it leads to this other thing. Now, again, if you think back to the blood cell analogy, we have a restricted viewpoint of all this. We can't see all of the causes and conditions leading to the effects. And of course, all of those effects become causes and conditions for future effects. We can't see all of these. If for no other reason than, well, they've been going on since whatever day one was, which I wasn't here for. There was a time when doctors did not wash their hands between patients. Not because they were incompetent per se. We just didn't know germs existed. Right? We had a restricted, limited viewpoint of, well, cause and effect. We at some point were able to develop tools that we were able to use to increase and expand that viewpoint, like the microscope I mentioned. Over time, we begin to replace, say, the superstitions, the myths that we used to fill in the gaps of our knowledge. We began to replace those with some harder evidence. All right. I saw this funny comic a couple of weeks ago. I don't remember the exact details, but it was something along the lines of somebody from, say, a first world society talking to someone from a presumably backwards tribal society, right? Saying something to the effect of, they're making fun of this person because they worship the sun. To which the tribal person responds, well, at least the thing I worship exists. But we use myth and superstition and so forth to try to explain the things that we don't have explanations for. But that doesn't mean that the explanations are not there. our inability to necessarily see a relationship of cause and effect doesn't mean the relationship doesn't exist. It kind of has to. And I find that making that distinction of recognizing, okay, there's some crazy shit going on, but the craziness that I perceive is coming from a place of perhaps an amount of activity, the intensity of the activity, the characteristics of the activity, but it's not random. It's not an accident. It's part of a greater whole. And that entire whole, if we could see it, would make perfect sense. Now, there's kind of a good news, bad news situation here, with the bad news being we can't fix the whole world. But the good news is we don't have to. We don't have to. In my experience, it makes much more sense to start with ourselves. And it actually ends up being the case that when we do start with ourselves, that's what ultimately ends up indirectly helping the outside world more. So if we're going to work with our inner world, we need a starting point. We need some kind of a solid foundation to work with. And when I think of an inner starting point, I go back even further for myself than when I started learning about Buddhism or practicing mindfulness or any of this stuff. I actually go back to my college days. When I was in college, I was a social psych major, but I liked to get all my classes out of the way in the mornings to have my afternoons free. And just so happens, most of the philosophy classes being offered at my school were in the mornings. So I just ended up taking a ton of philosophy classes, almost enough to have a minor in it, simply because, well, the classes were offered at a convenient time. And in one of the classes, Descartes inevitably came up, and I really enjoyed studying Descartes. I liked where he came from. He came from a point of ultimate skepticism. Like, what can I actually believe? What is actually true? And he started from the standpoint of anything that I'm experiencing, oh, this could just be presented to me by some evil demon that is trying to fool me into thinking that this thing's real and that thing's real and that thing's real. I can't trust any of this. So what do I know for sure? What can I really believe is actually true? And I love where he went next, which was, well, if there's an evil demon fooling me, there has to at least be a consciousness that's being fooled. From where it was just a hop and a skip for him to go from that to, I think, therefore I am. Right? I don't know what I am, but there's something here. There's something here foolable. So I can bank on that. And that's not miles away from where we can start in our practice, where we can simply begin with, well, what do we know? What do we know for sure? Well, what's here? What's here? What is the felt sense? But not even just the felt sense, but what is the identification that we are having with a felt sense? Right? As I often say, there's a world of difference between, say, I'm angry and I feel anger. Huge difference in the amount that we are identifying with an experience. And there's another huge jump in going from I feel anger to there is anger. Now we've taken the I out of it, right? And then we can take it a level further and say, there are sensations and perceptions associated with this concept of anger. So now we're taking away some of the automatic labeling that we put on a whole collection of experiences and think of it as one thing. Again, think of the blood cells being just one part of an entire functioning human body. We can even take this another level down and simply say there is the sensation. There is the sensation. There are the perceptions of our breathing. And can that be enough of a starting point for us? I've found that it can be, not because of things that we are adding to our experience, but because of things that we are removing from the experience. Like that identification. Like that automatic labeling of a whole collection of sensations and perceptions as being one monolithic thing. There's always that inner voice. That inner voice that sees clearly. The inner voice that knows. But we don't always hear that inner voice because of, well, all the shit we've been piling on top of it, right? And that's what we're doing here, is removing some of those layers. And part of removing those layers is simply not just seeing the layers, but seeing how and why we put them there. And don't look now, but what I'm talking about again is karma, cause and effect. We've been layering these things, whatever it is that we're carrying around with ourselves, usually in these forms of identification, this selfing, coming up from our desires or our fears and our aversions, right? These things that we're layering on top and carrying around with ourselves. For some reason, there's always a reason. Usually trying to feel happy, comfort, safety, right? Not quite catching how, as well-intended as that is, it's kind of going sideways. And, well, what happens when it starts going sideways? Oh, well, let me try layering this thing on top and see how that works out. Great. Oops. So we want to start peeling those layers back. And that's when we start to be able to hear that inner voice again. And that combination of peeling the layers back and hearing that inner voice, that's a big step towards cultivating sanity in my experience. This practice is about asking the right questions as opposed to knowing the answers in advance. So we ask these questions of, okay, what's here? Also, we ask, what is the most skillful thing to do with what's here in this moment? Another note that I had for this session when I did it a couple of years ago, at that time I was participating in an online series of sessions that Larry Rosenberg from the Cambridge Insight Meditation Center was doing. And during one of the questions that another participant asked, they said something to the effect of, this was when the presidential election was coming up, and someone was expressing all of this anger that they were experiencing in relation to what our then president was doing. And Larry said, okay, well, is your anger making a difference to his behavior? Well, I mean, no, I guess not. And this isn't a way of saying don't feel what you're feeling, because that doesn't end well. But a way of seeing more clearly what's coming up, what am I doing with what's coming up, what are the results of that? Again, cause and effect. Cause and effect's going to happen either way. So we might as well be skillful about it, right? I mean, those are your options. Bring a skillful awareness to the process or don't. So it's not about not acting. And that's one of the myths that we fall for sometimes in this practice is, oh, well, I just, I can just sit back and let the world happen and I don't have to do anything because I'm being mindful and just being at peace with whatever bullshit's going on, even if it's terrible. No. It doesn't mean we don't act. It means we're building a more solid foundation based on clear seeing so that we can act more skillfully. So we say, what's coming up? What am I doing with what's coming up? And is it working? The classic colloquial definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over and over again when it's not working. So we want to continue to check in. Is this working? Because that informs what our intention should be for implementing whatever the next cause and condition are. It was during one of those same sessions with Larry Rosenberg that someone asked a really classic question in this practice, and he gave, of course, exactly the right answer, not surprisingly. Someone was talking about how they were out walking on a moonlit night, and they were looking at the moon and just enjoying the moon, and then noticed how they were thinking about the moon. And started to become concerned about, well, I'm not supposed to be thinking about the moon. I'm supposed to just be with the moon, right? And so then they started thinking more about how they were thinking about the moon and started thinking how they should stop thinking about the moon. And I think we all know where this goes. And so the question posed to Larry was, well, is this thinking a problem? And Larry says, well, yeah, in as much as you're making it a problem. Thinking is not a problem unless we think it's a problem. It's a classic way of how we're getting in our own way as we're trying to negotiate our inner and our outer worlds. It's another case of cause and effect. This person, in an attempt to, be a good Buddhist and alleviate their suffering, was causing all kinds of suffering, right? And that's going to come up in this practice. I know that pattern very well. I'm sure I have not engaged in it for the last time. But it's exactly what we came to see. It's just another one of those layers. So for me, this cultivating of sanity really comes down to recognizing, no matter how batshit crazy things seem, it's still coming from a place of cause and effect that if I had a wide enough vantage point, it would all make perfect sense. But even if it didn't, I can still come back to those central questions of what's here now? What am I doing with what's here now? How's that working out? What should I do next? And just repeat that cycle. And we can do that with something as basic as the breathing, or as something as chaotic seemingly chaotic, as some kind of external event that has a lot of vibrant and potent energy about it. It applies to everything, including this practice itself. So maybe let's take a few minutes and practice with it. The one cue that I always like to give before we begin is to have your hips elevated higher than your knees if you are sitting, if possible. It's good for your posture and your breathing. If that's not possible right now, not a big deal, something to keep in mind for next time perhaps. And let's begin as we always do, by imagining we are suspended from the ceiling by a piece of string attached to the top of our heads. As a nice cue to sit up straight without adding any extra tension to do so. If there is some tension right now, well, guess what? That's an effect of some cause. Something's causing the effect of tension. Could be something at a physical level, could be something at a mental level, an emotional level, combination. And how we approach tension, how we relate to that thing that is coming up, that tension that is here, becomes a cause and condition for, well, some other effect, right? Which is why I always say if there's some tension here, it's allowed to be here. Because I have found repeatedly that trying to eradicate tension forcibly doesn't work. That's just bringing more tension to the tension that's already here. Or, to put it the way I termed it earlier, it's adding another layer on top of a layer that's already here. So then the question becomes, okay, what would be most skillful in this case then? Well, how about not doing that? Well, what's not doing that? Well, just letting it be, I suppose. Bring some attention to it and seeing what it does when I don't interfere with it. And that's what I offer to you here now is, if you're experiencing some tension, simply notice it and see what it does. And if you're not experiencing any tension right now, great. You can observe the lack of tension. Now, in order to observe something like tension, or a lack of tension, we need that vantage point that I was talking about earlier. How are we going to observe something skillfully without having an appropriate vantage point? And that's where our breathing comes in. That's our anchor. That's our foundation. That's what we use to keep us here in the present. So that we can notice what other processes, like tension, are arising, playing out, perhaps passing. So let's come to our breathing and simply notice that as it arises, plays out, passes. And start with that as our square one. Just allowing the breathing to be as it is. Even just with the breathing, we can begin asking skillful questions. What's here now? Could be noticing an in-breath. Could be noticing an out-breath. Could be noticing a pause in between. Could be noticing a feeling about it coming up that's pleasant, or it's unpleasant, or neither. You may notice a desire to control and shape the breathing. Perhaps we are controlling and shaping the breathing and notice an unwillingness to stop. What's here? How am I relating to what's here? Not how should I be relating to what's here. How am I actually relating to what's here? That's what we came to see. So let's see it. What's here now? How am I relating to what's here now? How do I feel about what's here now? How does the mind react when we try to keep things this basic, this simple? When a mind that's so accustomed to overstimulation is suddenly confronted with a practice like this, sometimes we find it's actually looking for some of that chaos and insanity, somehow craving it, because that's what it's been feeding on for so long. And suddenly we're stopping the food supply for a minute. And if the mind is rebelling against that, that's a pretty big red flag. We might want to check that out. Again, this is what we came to see. So let's see it. What's here now? How am I relating to what's here now? How do I feel about what's here now? How am I relating to how I feel about what's here now? Right here, you can see how the interweaving of these causes and conditions happens just at that level. It's happening within us, and we usually don't even see it. So if we can't even see that inside of us, of course the outside world is going to seem like chaotic mayhem. But the more we develop the skill and capacity to see the causes and conditions arising within us and our role in them, we can't help but see that everything is arising from causes and conditions, and then becoming causes and conditions themselves. All from asking ourselves these basic, skillful questions. What's here now? What is the current experience? And what am I doing with it? And how's that working out? And based on how it's working out, what should I try next? I'll wrap up today's sitting, as I often do, with a short passage from Thanissaro Bhikkhu. Figure out what your actions are and what the results are, how they're connected, and which actions give rise to better results than others. This is why we meditate, to develop those powers. So it's not a matter of you versus the system outside, where you are trustworthy and the system outside is not. Rather, it's learning how to sort out inside you which perceptions and which thought constructs are actually more trustworthy than others. By staying solidly in the present moment and solidly with your intention to stay with the breath, you put yourself in a better position to evaluate what comes into the mind. If a thought of greed, anger, or delusion comes in, you'll be able to sense it and to see what it does, because you're more sensitive to what's going on. Thank you, everyone. I'll put a few links in the chat, and then we'll get to some Q&A. So the first link there is to my website, mindfulnessinbluejeans.com. These free sessions are supported by one-on-one sessions that I do with folks who would like to dive a little bit deeper into some of these things to help work through what might be going on in their lives, as so many of us have done over the last 2,600 years or so now. So if you would like to drop me a line through there or set something up, the first link is my webpage, and the second link is directly to my sessions booking page. I have my YouTube link up there, the Mindfulness in Blue Jeans channel. If you would like to subscribe on there, I put up sessions like these, some of the ones I do on Insight Timer and so forth. I put up a session about once every couple of weeks or so, if you'd like to check those out. And the same one's also up on the Patreon page, which is linked there as well. And I think we can jump into some Q&A. Hey, Phyllis. You're muted.
Maybe that was a good thing.
Well, we'll find out. For all I know, I've been muted this whole time and nobody said anything.
Well, when you mentioned the word tension, and then you were talking about layers, my breath did something really strange. Initially, I noticed my breathing was quite shallow, so there was tension there. And as I began relaxing my abdominals and the breath became deeper and quieter, I had this crazy dreamlike image of an avocado spread, which I was just dealing with a platter for tomorrow, and there were these dips. And my abdomen felt hungry, and I was taking a palette from a painter's palette, and I was dipping into the avocado dip and spreading it on my abdomen. Because it felt hungry. It was very soothing. You didn't know that about me, did you? I just wanted to share that. The deeper the breath, the more I was relaxing and realized that I was probably hungry, and the avocado dip. Okay. I don't know what that says, but it felt good. And I was pleased that I noticed, and I fed the hunger.
Thank you for sharing that. That's terrific. One of the translations for dukkha and suffering that comes up in this practice, feeding. I alluded to this a little bit about when I was saying during the sitting about an overstimulated mind feeding on all this stimulation and what happens when we stop that food supply. I chose that wording very deliberately because it was in line with this notion of feeding and how we are constantly feeding on things, mentally as well as physically. And this is where our suffering arises. And one of the traps that we fall into in this practice sometimes is thinking, oh, the problem's feeding, then I just need to stop feeding. Like that's going to work. And that's, to use the Buddhist terminology, that's not skillful. What we actually do in this practice is feed on more skillful things as we make our way to an eventual point, whether practical or theoretical, of enlightenment, nirvana, where there is no more feeding. It's really interesting, that image that you had and the feelings that came out of it, even just the noticing of it to begin with, because it sounds like you didn't even realize you were hungry until that sense of ease and relaxation allowed it to arise. And that in itself is almost kind of like what I was talking about with the inner voice, where it's like, okay, you removed a layer and it's like, oh, holy shit, look at this. Mm-hmm. And really drives home the point to which we are, when we're in this mode of tense overstimulation, we are not in touch with what's actually here. And now when we start to inquire about what's actually here and start to remove a layer or two of that overstimulation, whatever else we've put on there, it's like, oh, well, holy shit, look at all this stuff that's just been flying completely under the radar. And I think it's really fascinating that you not only saw that, but then also what arose was this really fascinating mental image that really combined, if you will, sort of this feeding along with really some artistry. You know, it's really fascinating. And the result was a sense of ease. Mm-hmm. And that's That's a really interesting thing to notice. And I'll mention this as an aside. That's the kind of experience that in itself can have the potential for suffering, in the sense that it's very common for us to want to recreate that. It's like, oh, I had this wonderful experience, and geez, so next time I feel hungry, I should just be able to do that, this sort of a thing. And really the practice, what you noticed come up, the practice was really just about noticing it and noticing what the effects were. And now one of the biggest challenges in this practice is when we've had what I would consider a positive experience like that, is to notice that we had a positive experience and let it go. Because the next round of suffering very often is to try to hold on to that pleasant experience that arose and keep trying to recreate it and be like, okay, I need to be able to do that again. And that ends up creating suffering. So kind of a spoiler alert for what might be coming up next, or, something to watch out for is like, okay, you had an interesting, pleasant experience and have experienced some clear seeing. What matters is that you had the clear seeing, not so much that it was a pleasant experience. It's nice it was a pleasant experience. What matters is you had the clear seeing of seeing it and how it played out. That's what really matters. And if the next upcoming experience is one that is not so pleasant, that does not matter so much as that you see it just like you saw this. That's what really matters.
Understood. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that. That was quite profound. Yeah. Thank you. I will wrap it up there. Feel free to drop me a line if you have any other questions. Phyllis, have a great time tomorrow, will you please?
We will.
Yeah. This is Mr. Phyllis?
On the other side of that. So this is an effect of some cause, and I haven't figured out what that is.
Sometimes we're not going to see the causes, but if the effect is working, we roll with it.
Yeah, when you started talking about blood cells, and the random stuff, we don't know what they're doing, but they are a cause which sort of cascades upwards, which supports other things, but it also goes the other way. They're a result of stuff going down here, electrons flying around molecules. It's, where is that continuum? Where am I? It doesn't matter. Just observing.
Yeah.
I know what I don't know, and I don't know what I don't know, but I can observe this.
Right. Sometimes just knowing what we don't know, or knowing that we don't know what we don't know, is in itself the clearest seeing we can have. One of the classic sayings is that the worst delusion that we can have in the practice is the one that says we're not suffering from delusion. Yeah.
Thank you.
So cheers. Have a great time tomorrow. Congrats to you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Ron.
Cheers, everyone.
Have a good weekend.
Take care. You too. Bye now.